right, so indirect correlation, not negative correlation. Indirect correlation, obviously, as x increases, y decreases, and it could be vice versa. I'll show you vice versa in a second. The more you exercise, the less you weigh. Ugh, how embarrassing. I've got a typo there. It should be weigh, W-E-I-G-H, instead of W-A-Y. I would say I have to fire my secretary, but I wrote this, so my bad. But you get the idea. The more you exercise, the less you weigh. And obviously, if you know anything about exercise and personal health and everything like this, that's not necessarily true. You can exercise all the time and not necessarily lose weight. And muscle has is denser than fat, so that it actually can add weight when you start working out. I think the kids call it getting gains, becoming swole. I've never had gains, and I'm not swole, so I hope those are the appropriate uses of those terms. But obviously, the more you exercise, you don't necessarily weigh less, right? I actually am fairly, not very heavy for being 6 feet tall, but it's not because I exercise all the time. It's because of fast metabolism and dependency on coffee. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, but you see there's a trend. Many people, if they're trying to lose weight, will start exercising more because the trend towards burning more calories, yada, yada, yada. You see what I'm saying. Vice versa, of course, x decreases, y increases. The less time you take to complete a test, the more you'll get wrong. So as test time decreases, questions gotten wrong increases. But, of course, this is not gospel either, because usually when students are taking my exams, the first person who's done either gets the lowest grade in the class or the highest grade in the class. Either you know the material really well and don't need to take very long, or you didn't have a prayer and you're ready to get done with your suffering. Either way, right? So you understand, not necessarily a hard and fast rule, right? So as I said, two, they are not negative, they are indirect, and they are moving in opposite directions. That's probably the best way to consider it. This is the way I remember it. If you look at a scatter plot, we see something like this. You can't see, I believe the x-axis is cut off for you, but this is, on the y-axis we've got attendance, absences from math class, and then on the x-axis we have math scores. So if you'll notice here in this case, as people's attendance, or absences from the math class increase, their test scores decrease, their math scores in general decrease, right? So if you look to the right, the bottom right, you see people with very few, if any, absences. Their math scores are the highest in relation to their absences, as opposed to people that have 14 or more. That person there has, looks like 15 absences and is scoring very, very poorly in math, right? Notice in this case, the scatter plot points down and to the right, not up and to the right, down and to the right. So that's always going to be a good visual indicator of an indirect correlation with the way the direction, the line of best fit is moving. So with these scatter plots here, obviously I've got two very common, or not very common ones, but pretty densely packed ones here, right? And in case you were wondering, where did all of my technology fees go? You ready for this? I've got an animation for you. Watch the graph on the left. Bam. Did you see that? I'm going to show you again, just because I want you to know those fees are well spent. Bam. All right. So on this left one here, the data is wife's age on the y-axis and x-axis is husband's age. And notice how all the dots are really tightly clustered close to that line, right? This is a visual indication that the correlation is very strong. There's not a lot of deviation from this pattern, right? So people tend to marry someone who's approximately their age, right? Me, I'll be very honest, I like the older ladies. So my wife is a full 11 months older than me. See what I did there? You thought I was going to say 11 years, didn't you? No, she's only about a year older than me. But, for example, occasionally we have people that will be what we refer to as outliers. We talk about outliers in 7311. My college roommate actually married a lady who is 28 years older than he is. They've been married for 5 years. They seem happy as clams. In case you're wondering, too, once again, if you think of correlation, what variable could bring a couple together when there's a 28-year age difference? Almost always people will say, oh, money. Nope, he doesn't have any money, and neither does she. They seem to just share love, which is just makes me so happy, because he's a nice man, and she seems like a nice lady, too. Anyway, all that is to say that they would be outliers. In this case, they don't follow that usual trend of marrying someone who's close to their age, right? And if we look to this graph on the right, this is in Nevada. You'll notice you've got mean annual temperature on the y-axis and elevation on the x-axis, which seems like that should be reversed. You would think elevation because going, whatever, anyway. But once again, technology fees at work, bam, there it is, right? And in this case, notice how line of best fit doesn't actually have them as tightly clustered. You've got more data points on the graph on the left and a tighter clustering on the graph on the left as well. The graph on the right represents much fewer data points and less tight clustering. This graph on the right would be an indirect correlation. On the one on the left, you would see a direct correlation. On the one on the right, you see indirect. However, the one on the left, the direct correlation most likely is much stronger, not just because it has more data, but because there's tighter clustering. and the right one being less of a strong correlation because of that reduced amount of data and looser clustering in that case, right? So once again, just kind of visual depictions of trends of how things go. And notice I keep using the word trends, right? We'll talk more in this class too about how outliers can really mess up the trend dramatically. An outlier can totally throw off the pattern and reduce the significance, in some cases make it a non-significant correlation. But we'll talk about that. We got time. Okay, so as I said, I started the previous recording with the idea of correlation versus causation, and I've already answered this question because I got really excited at the beginning there, right? Temperature. What connects violent crime and ice cream sales? And believe it or not, I was able to find an image of an ice cream cone holding a shotgun for whatever reason. I have no idea why anybody would bother to animate that, and you can't see that picture very well on the right. This is not my child, in case you're like, why is your son holding a gun? He looks like my son, actually, but the gun in his hand there at the bottom, you can see it very at the bottom of the picture. This is a Getty image. It's stamped on there. Not my son, in case you're like, why is your child toting a weapon? But anyway, violent crime and temperature, right? So what do we do with this data? Can we establish causation? We cannot. We cannot use that word. Causation is a coveted word in our field. Cannot use it in this case, right? However, if it's 115 degrees outside and you see somebody who's looking very, very angry, you might want to walk a little bit wider around them because they'll have a higher chance of punching you than they would if it was a normal temperature, right? Anyway, this is all about correlation. And of course, as we see temperatures go up, the violent crime goes up, we're simply just seeing two variables moving in the same direction. That's all it is. This is why I really want you to be cautious about this. This is also, by the way, why I had you read that article last week about head injuries and energy drinks. That is simply two variables that happen to be moving in the same direction. They want you to believe causation, but they're simply pointing this out and saying, ah ha 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 ha, be careful with those energy drinks. And of course you should be, but not because they are causing brain injuries, right? Same kind of idea. Temperature is what's referred to as a covariate. This might be a new term for you. I want you to be aware of this. Covariate is a third variable. So if we think of ice cream sales and gun crime as X and Y variables, temperature is what I would call a Z variable. The third variable that explains the relationship between X and Y, the covariate, right? And a covariate is different from a confound. We talked about confounds in the previous course. Covariates are bigger than confounds because they are covariates are different from confounds because they are bigger, right? If you take away temperature, ice cream sales and gun crime have nothing to do with each other mathematically. Nothing. It explains the entirety of the relationship, right? I used the example of my friends being 28 years separate in their marriage, or 28 years the difference in their marriage, right? And when you see couples like that, often we think that the covariate is money, right? I'm not saying she's a gold digger, but we use temperature, money rather, as a covariate, right? Because we're always looking for that. Well, why did that happen? What brought those two together? And in other relationships, we say, oh, the covariate is love, right? If they're very different personalities. For people that know my wife and I very well, she's quiet and reserved, and I'm obviously the complete opposite of that. There's a lot of things about our personalities that are very different, but we share very deep love. Love, in this case, is the covariate. And it's important to look for that. What I would ask in this course as we go through is always remember to look for the covariate. Never simply accept X and Y moving simply because of each other. Always look for that covariate. And it's not being skeptical, it's being critical, but that represents good research. And that, my friends, is correlation.